those are literally the two things that caused me to be like, shit, I got to get out to like one of these coasts and like start creating. And it also caused me to realize I don't ever want to be in a position where I'm debating or wondering, should I have gone and tried the entrepreneurial pursuit?
Hey there, Powderkeg fans. This is episode 116 of Powderkeg Igniting Startups, the show for entrepreneurs, leaders, and innovators building remarkable tech companies in areas decidedly outside of Silicon Valley. I'm your host, Matt Hunkler, and today we will be speaking with Raz Razgaitis. He's the co-founder and CEO of Denver-Based FloWater, which is a company that's revolutionizing the way people get drinking water. Raz started his career in Fortune 500 companies, including Johnson & Johnson and Eli Lilly, spent some time in Indiana, which is my home state. And since then, he's been the CEO at several high-growth companies, out to Silicon Valley, back to the Midwest again, and he's combining 20-plus years of leadership and tech experience to deliver FloWater, which is a water refill station product that keeps 2.38 plastic water bottles from reaching our landfills and oceans every second. I love that stat, and I love that he's doing that. So I'm super glad to have him on the show. He's got lots of thoughts on the art of building a disruptive brand and using innovation and technology to change paradigms to save the planet. Raz, thanks so much for being here today, man.
Matt, thank you. It's great to be on this show, and I love talking to another Hoosier and someone that's building in the Midwest.
Absolutely. It's a real pleasure, and I love the product that you're building, and I've been reading all about it, and I love that you're building it from Denver, Colorado. But first, I want to, before we dive into what you're doing now, I always like getting a little bit of the backstory because I always think it's very interesting to hear how a founder got to doing this crazy thing called entrepreneurship, which, with all of the data and statistics and knowledge that we have, really no sane human should actually go and do. But I really appreciate what you're building now. How did it all kind of get started for you, and how did you end up in the Midwest?
Well, when you say end up in the Midwest, you mean the most recent track back to the Midwest, right? Or from the very beginning?
Take me all the way back to the beginning,
yeah.
man.
Though I was born in Texas at an early age, and of course, when I'm talking to a Texan, I claim that all day long, because that has about the highest ROI of any state. But for all intents and purposes, was raised in Ohio. I grew up in Columbus, Ohio. My dad taught at Ohio State and was responsible for a variety of academic and had a variety of different academic roles. And then he actually ended up running commercial licensing and business development for Battelle Labs in Columbus, Ohio, which I don't know how well known it is now, but back 25, 35, 45 years ago is fairly well known. Yeah. And I went to school. I went to a small school in Indiana, Anderson University, which anytime I'm talking to somebody in New York or SF, I basically just tell them, because they've never heard of it, I tell them it's the Harvard of the Midwest, because I get to position this however I really want to position it. So in fact, I've said that so many times. I've said Anderson University is the Harvard of the Midwest so many times in California and Silicon Valley that I have now run into people where I'll tell them the name and they're like, oh, I have heard that's like the Harvard of the Midwest. It probably started with me saying this over the last 10 or 15 years. That's
amazing.
Yeah, it's kind of funny.
Our first guest on this show, as you pointed out, was also an Anderson University grad, Christian Anderson.
Yeah.
So it's a good vintage. I mean, like these, and I think was the same year as you, right?
He was the same year. Yeah,
That's
he's a
crazy.
super talented guy.
Small world.
So I went to undergrad at AU. I thought going into undergrad, I wanted to either be a pediatrician or a trial lawyer, which would have either probably made me a pretty scary pediatrician or a pretty scary trial lawyer. I saw cadavers, decided I cannot go through med school dealing with things that are bleeding. And literally that was just one of the drivers for me. I just like, I don't have the stomach for it. And then the other part of it was, I think something about entrepreneurialism is that I do not think that there's some genetic code absolutely unequivocally for most people. I think I do think there's a binary on it, which is some people are completely wired to be an entrepreneur and from the very get-go, and some people are not. And then I think there's a fair amount in the mid-range, which is, why I think you see a lot of people in SF that are entrepreneurs, is because those people that are in the mid-range are just much more as a result of, your surroundings, to be able to identify pathways to become entrepreneurial. And so I don't know that I would certainly say I'm entrepreneurial, but I don't know that I had the 100% binary, I got to do this. In fact, I probably don't have that, in the sense that, my very first job coming out of school was at Johnson & Johnson. And so as I got into, my first year of undergrad, I recognized I didn't want to go spend 7 years in medical school. I didn't have it in me to do that. So I kind of lost that dream. In fact, very few people don't even know that was a dream of mine, kind of going into undergrad, and quickly lost it for those reasons that I mentioned. But I loved business. I was passionate about business. I ran a 70-person kind of startup company when I was in college, in between some years in college, that was very entrepreneurial, but very, very low tech, I will add. And we might come back to that. But I really enjoyed business and wanted to get out in the trenches. And I ended up getting a marketing undergrad from Anderson University. And leaving school, as I was getting ready to graduate, I really wanted to move. I wanted to go out to New York or SF. Like, those were the places, I felt like, at the time, I felt like, well, this is where you have to be if you really want to make it. Or I felt like these are super competitive places and I want to go compete in super competitive places and like go play, football at that level, kind of metaphorically. And I don't think that's the case anymore. That used to be the case a lot more. I mean, of course it did, just because there was not nearly the infrastructure, but now there's great tech companies being built all over the US. But in any case, when I was graduating, I had 3 job opportunities that I'd narrowed it down to. One was with IBM, one was with HP, and another was with Johnson & Johnson. So kind of going out of school, you're thinking like, all right, like this is like what I'm geared up for. I should go get my classical training, like J&J. Each of those companies were kind of the Google of that time in '96. And so I took the job at J&J, moved out to the East Coast, outside of New York City. And so that was kind of, that was the exit point of my Anderson University undergraduate experience and my entrance into business. But of course, as the story goes on, I did not stay in that environment very long, because I kept having this nagging underbelly of an entrepreneurial bug, where I wanted to not necessarily have to be the person that goes and starts stuff. Like, I sometimes hear entrepreneurs talk and say, well, I could never, that's why I want to go work for myself. That's an idea that I can't relate to, because I think the reality is, if you're an entrepreneur, you're working for somebody. I mean, it might be a board, it might be investors, it might be, there might be advisors or their customers, but at the end of the day, you're working for somebody. So I had this nagging entrepreneurial proclivity that I've enjoyed working at big companies and at mid-sized companies, but I've also really enjoyed starting and building things.
Did you get that sort of foundational break into the world of business training and skills that you were looking for when you went and worked for Johnson & Johnson and Eli Lilly?
Well, that's a really interesting question. I think that yes and no. I think the short answer is really yes and no. The longer answer on that is yes, in the way that, there's some really, really smart people working at J&J, and there was a lot of just templated training, programmatic, around like best practices around selling, business development, but then also marketing. I ended up after J&J working at HQ in Eli Lilly's headquarters in Indianapolis. And I launched what's now, I was on the launch team for $1 billion drug. It's now $1 billion drug. When we launched, it was a couple hundred million, and I think we got it up to like 400 million at the time that I'd left. But, in many ways, marketing strategy, business, corp dev, I think Fortune 500 companies are a terrific breeding ground for learning how to navigate and deal with a lot of different dynamics, a lot of different personalities, a lot of different politics, and structure and methodology and thinking.
Do you have?
Don't.
Yeah, I was just gonna ask if you have like one thing that maybe you repeat to your team often now that you learned back in your Fortune 500 days.
I'll tell you, actually, I learned it at my commencement at Anderson University from Mitch Daniels, your one-time governor,
Oh, wow.
who ended up becoming my mentor for years, and I still will periodically email him. But,
no kidding.
Yeah, I'll tell you what he said to me at commencement. So this is, my dad dragged me up so Mitch was some big muckety-muck at Lilly at the time that he spoke at my commencement. And then he went on to be like Secretary of Treasury for Bush and governor after that, and so on and so forth. But
he's running Purdue University now.
Now he's running Purdue. I've actually tried to reconnect with him. I haven't been successful yet, and there's not a lot of business in West Lafayette for me.
Yeah.
So it's hard to find time to do it, but I'd love to connect with him again. But he said, my dad dragged me up after, and he's like, hey, you're going to go work for J&J. This guy's a big deal at Lilly. Go ask him some questions. And actually, my dad asked the question. This is like typical, like, it's not that I was shy. I wanted to go hang with my friends. It was graduation. And so I go up and I meet Mitch. I was excited to meet him. He's a great commencement speaker and a terrific individual. And my dad said, hey, what's one piece of advice that you would give a young guy starting out on his career that he should take with him forever? And Mitch, like, unflinchingly just said, always do the right thing. And I don't want to sound self-righteous either. I would love to say I've always done the right thing. I've fouled that up before, 100%. Yeah. But part of life is fouling things up and then doing your best you can to fix them and get back and redirect towards a mantra or a set of beliefs or your vision or your value. And so that story, in fact, I ended up later, after I got hired and recruited by Lilly and moved back to Indianapolis, after I'd been working for J&J for years, I emailed Mitch and I reconnected with him, and he became a mentor of mine while I was at Lilly and he was at Lilly. And that was one thing that stuck through with me is, always do the right thing. And, when it comes time to making a decision and we don't know what to do, because they all seem like they're good outcomes or it's in the gray zone, we'll use one of those as a litmus of what's the right thing to do here. I mean, hopefully you're always starting with that, but it doesn't always mean that you can start with that lens and then you could go 5 miles down the road and find out, okay, wait, maybe that wasn't the right thing. And so revisiting that throughout has been helpful for me in a career, both aspirationally, both kind of thematically in terms of, how to operate, and then also correctionally in terms of, hey, screwed that one up. I gotta get back on making sure that, I am or we are doing the right thing. That's
really good advice. Simple, but profound.
Not all of it's going to have a tie back to Indiana, I promise. And Mitch Daniels, governor, and Anderson, but a lot do, actually. I mean, that's where so much of my formative upraising and learning came from my earlier years in Ohio, but then my undergrad and my grad program in Indiana.
You got to start with the right foundation.
It's one of the great things about people in the Midwest, by the way. I mean, truly. I love hiring
100%.
people in the Midwest because there's just a different kind of value ethos that genetically kind of has gotten developed in them. So not to say that people don't have great values in New York. I love New Yorkers. I mean, if there's anything I'm probably most genetically predisposed towards, it's being a New Yorker. But there's something unique about people in the Midwest, and it's just one of the attributes that they have with them of, street hustle, hard work, and a variety of others. So
doing the right thing is a good part of that. I'm curious to know what kind of finally tipped the scale for you to actually bite the bullet and follow on some of those entrepreneurial tendencies. And I'm wondering if there was someone or someones around you that kind of pushed you over the edge.
Yeah, there was. Actually, I'm not going to say his name, but there was a guy I remember this conversation. This is I'm 46. This is 23, 22 years ago. And there was something that had two things completely tipped me. And they were like, not the defining moment, but it was a moment of truth that caused me to radically think about executing on moving entrepreneurial. And so I was in Indy at the time, living in Broad Ripple. And I was also doing a lot of travel to California and San Francisco. So I, fly out to SF and ironic, I live part-time still, 7 minutes from SFO. So, I kind of have this split dichotomy where my primary residence is in Denver, but, I spend a lot of time in SF and have a place out there as well. And, I'd fly into SFO, I'd get to the rental car place, and then I would get on the 101 and I'd be driving up and down between like SF and San Jose. And this was like 97, 98, 99. And everything was buzzing. I mean, you just like billboards and like pets.com was the thing, and Dr. Coop, probably no one listening even remembers Dr. I was in the e-health space. Ultimately, that's what caused me to make the jump. But that was a big deal on Medscape and WebMD, and some of these still exist, and on, Excite. And I remember just like feeling this level of electricity and this energy around what could be created. It's one of the things that I love, and I think it's one of the things that entrepreneurs love, is they love creating. They love the idea of ideating and creating and executing, also executing. Real entrepreneurs execute too. So like everyone, that's all that other stuff is just daydreaming. You're not an entrepreneur if you're just doing the other things and not doing the executing. Because quite frankly, probably most of being an entrepreneur is actually, in terms of raw time, is executing. And so that was a tipping point for me, as I remember like landing one day in SF, driving on the 101 and seeing all of this. And I said to myself, I have to get out here, or I have to figure out how I can get in this ecosystem. And then I'd go back to Indy, and I had this nice house and like super comfortable, and the people were great. I was on this career path that was really at least safe, or so I thought. And, I thought I was on a pretty fast career trajectory. And then I remember talking to this guy. I remember his name. I remember his first and last name. I hadn't thought of his name in 20 years plus, and I can remember his name. So I'm trying to be careful not to say it. And I remember asking him talking at the end of a meeting, how much time he had left of retirement. And he basically said X number of years, months, and days. And he'd been a long timer. And I remember leaving that meeting, and I never forgotten that, because the only other time I've ever heard anyone describe like time left in that context was when people were in movies in prison, talking about how many days and weeks and hours that they had left to serve. And that sounds really ridiculous, but honestly, those are two things. Like I had all these other things. I had business plans I'd been writing. One of them was for a startup called Doc Knowledge that was going to be in an e-health space that I was working on in 97. Like I had, I was networking with people. All these things were happening. Those are literally the two things that caused me to be like, shit, I got to get out to like one of these coasts and like start creating. And it also caused me to realize I don't ever want to be in a position where I'm debating or wondering, should I have gone and tried the entrepreneurial pursuit? Because I totally admire people that spend a career in a company like Lilly. Super admirable. There's some really good work that's being done at companies. I'm not anti-big company, but
Sure.
For me, I felt like I needed to go and do something that was like an aspiration of mine, and I felt like I'd been programmed to go do, and that I would never regret at least pursuing it, and that I might seriously regret it if I didn't. So that was actually the genesis that sparked me, and that's what got me out to New York City. So I said I either want to go to SF or New York, and I I had a job offer that popped out kind of nowhere and got me into a startup. So I was like the 7th person hired in a startup that just raised 10 million or $7 million in capital in
Nice.
New York City in 2000. Actually, that's when I joined. So it took me about a year to kind of figure out where I was going to go, how to get out there. So I really started that process in mid '99 and moved out there in mid 2000.
Had that first internet bubble already
Yeah,
popped?
it
Wow.
did. It popped. So it popped in March of 2000. And so, you know, like I think if you left Lilly in '99 or '98 for a high flying tech startup, everyone's a millionaire on paper, like everyone's crushing it. I think it made a lot of, first of all, I don't know anyone that left Lilly. I was the first person that I know that I remember in that era of several years. I'm sure people left. I didn't know anybody because the deal at Lilly was that you get in, you like become a manager, you become a director. If you're on this path, even if you end as a director, you're going to end up with millions of dollars worth of stock options after 30 years. You're going to get to retire. You have this great package. So nobody left then. Now people leave all the time now. Since I left and things turned over and Lilly had layoffs, and like the reality is nothing is safe anymore.
Sure.
Like being an entrepreneur, ironically, was more safe for me than staying at Lilly. But to your question, the bubble burst in March of 2000, and I left in June of 2000 or July, something like that. And so
Wow.
I remember when I leave, I had people sit me down and they would say, like, I mean, they were just very direct. They said, "This is probably one of the dumbest things that you have ever done or will ever have done, because you're on this great career track. And not everyone said that, by the way, other people will pull me aside and be like, hey, like run, like go for it, make a run for it, like get out of here and do what you want to do." Like, not because they didn't love it, but they, like somewhat vicariously living through me, I think. But yeah, I had, it didn't seem like the wisest decision on paper at that time. If someone had laid it out, bubble had burst. I'm trying to think actually in terms of the timing of it all. Yeah, it had, yes, it had. And then I went through another brutally difficult, so the bubble had burst, still went out, and then we went through 9/11 a year later.
Yes.
And that was, I don't know, I mean, just economically, obviously it was way more tragic than the bubble bursting, but economically, what a lot of people don't realize is that if you were in an early stage company and a lot of your business was in the tri-state in that time, like you had multiple compounding issues there. And so I went out and was in New York from 2000 to 2002, where I ended up being the VP of sales and marketing for an early stage company that was in the e-health space. It was the web's very first syndicated health content creation vehicle.
Wow.
Doesn't sound super sexy, but what we were doing is we were powering people's health content across the interweb and creating our own content and syndicating it across the web. It's like PR Newswire for health content.
What did you find was the biggest difference between corporate business versus startup business?
Well, I mean, the speed, I cannot describe the speed and the urgency and the raw, like it's like going out and going from like, I think middle school, like playing middle school football or sports, just pick your sport, soccer or baseball, whatever, to playing like college level in terms of speed. I mean, I don't know that the people are any smarter. In fact, they might not be smarter at all. The people at corporate might be actually like kind of IQ. In fact, I'm quite sure of that. Like the people that I worked with at Eli Lilly, and I worked with some wicked smart people, and these all have like, for the most part, prestigious MBAs or PhDs or MDs, none of which I had, by the way. And the speed, though, is unparalleled. And, New York, but then layer a startup on top of that, having come from Indiana, Fortune 500. So that's one. The second is meritocracy wins, or it should win. I don't think you will find many successful startup companies where meritocracy doesn't generally win more often than not.
Yep.
And that is not the case in big companies. I mean, in fact, I just talked to a group of executives at a Denver Sustainability Summit. And then before that, I talked to some in Atlanta at some Green Business Forum, a bunch of sustainability executives from Fortune 500 companies. And one of the things that I really encouraged them to do, because they asked if I had any takeaway for people that were carrying sustainability back to their corporation. And one of the things that I really encouraged them to do was I guess if I were to synthesize the comment, it would be blow shit up, which is go and try a bunch of stuff and pilot and experiment and come up with a thesis, have a hypothesis, and then go start executing stuff. And I think that element of executing and meritocracy and driving things to the point of a binary outcome, right? Which is that binary outcome is not called hey, let's dish something up that we did it and it doesn't look so good, but let's kind of put window dressing on it so that people don't know what really, really good is versus really not good. And it's one of the jokes that I make from when I'm interviewing. I'm actually interviewing a CFO right after this. And one of the jokes that I'll make is, tell me about your least strength, which is, in other words, tell me what you suck at or you're not good at. But at Lilly, we used to say, well, what is your least strength? And sometimes the commentary gets so marginalized and diluted that it's a real threat to getting visibility and clarity as to what does the landscape look like. And the reality is, as entrepreneurs, we're all going into things that they don't make sense. If it was obvious, it would have already been done. So we're already going into things that are murky, and we're trying to find clarity amidst that murkiness, which is why meritocracy, the best idea winning, is so critical. And then putting points on the board. I mean, I think that's the other thing is the ultimate irony, and I'll end on this one before you go to your next question. But, I remember leaving at Lilly and I was getting kind of counseled of hey, this is super safe and you're going to end up a millionaire here. The reality is a bunch of people years later, and not that many years later, that were all super talented, hired from Wharton and Harvard and all these feeder schools into Lilly. A bunch of those, hires that were at my level got laid off. They got let go, which was unheard of at Lilly in corporate because of market changes and contractions and whatnot. And they weren't laid off because they were poor performers or not the strongest performers. It was tenure, right? And so I had the exact opposite experience where did this startup company, we raised a bunch of capital markets constricted. We couldn't raise more capital. So we either had to basically our portfolio was our lead investor was Omnicom. It was an agency in New York. And they basically said, we're closing the fund. If you guys can make it on your own and figure out how to do that, great, you can make it. Otherwise, all of our portfolio companies are just going to go into BK. And all of them did. Actually, I think we're the only company that returned capital to Omnicom out of all the investments that they made. And all of them didn't make it except for one, and that was ours. And the reason that we made it was because we were freaking relentless and tenacious, and we had good luck, but we figured out how to succeed. And I guess my point is, as part of that process, we hired a bunch of people. We had to let a bunch of people go. We went from 7 people to 70, 80, 100 people, down to 60 people, down to 30, back up again. But I had a job throughout all that. And why did I have a job? It was because, I was one of the performers. I mean, everyone that performed in that company did not lose their job. And it was based sheerly on merit and not time and not relationship and whatnot. In fact, I saw some very trusted friends of the founder of that company get let go in the process. Very brutally difficult. That would never happen in a big company. So that's my third one, is that meritocracy really, really wins the day. By the way, when I say meritocracy, that doesn't mean you can just go be an asshole and do whatever you want either. Sometimes I think people think, oh, if I'm kicking ass and I'm performing, I can do whatever I want. And I've learned as well. I mean, I probably erred on the side of taking meritocracy too liberally and just being too much of a bull in the china shop. And it's hard. You got to temper your own self. But I just want to be clear. Meritocracy is about performing, but it's also about aligning within the norms and the cultural expectations of the company that you're joining.
Any advice for people who work at startups or high growth tech companies to make sure what they're working on is providing the most value?
Yeah, I do. Actually, I've never heard anyone ask that question before, though I ask in an interview. It's a great question. That's just generally a great question for humanity, which is, how can I be adding more value? I mean, really. And I think the best thing that they can do, one, is really understand the strategy and the KPIs, the key performance indicators of their organization. And in fact, I'm halfway tempted to walk you over to a scorecard that we have. So we have a big digital dashboard in the company, and on it usually are 5 KPIs or 6 KPIs for the business. And these are the things that are the macroeconomic indicators that are most essential. Now, because it's in December, there's 1 KPI. It's down to 1. We've hit all of our numbers except for 1, and it's down to literally 1 number. So I had him change the board last week, and I said, it's all eyes on 1 number. And so 1 is to know what the KPIs are of the organization and the strategies and really understand it. I can understand that depending on where you are within your company, it might feel like it's hard to understand, or it doesn't fit because you're seeing a segment of the business rather than the macro of the business. But I've really encouraged, like in your town hall meetings every month or your huddles or what, ask your CEO the questions around strategy so that you understand, because believe me, he or she desperately wants you to understand what those are and know them so that you can be operating in accordance. So that's suggestion number 1. Suggestion number 2 is, I hate calling people managers, their managers or their bosses. I sometimes will slip and say, I call them now, I call it your up team. Your boss is your up team, and your direct report is your down team. And I would ask your up team, that's the next thing that you can do is at the end of every one of your one-on-ones, which I'm a fan of one-on-ones. I mean, I don't necessarily need to have it scheduled, but I think one-on-ones are essential. You have to have them for alignment. Otherwise, everyone's running in all sorts of directions, and it's your responsibility as your up team to be regularly having reporting with your one-on-ones. I use a very specific template for that with all my direct reports. Some of them might hate it. I don't know. I don't really give them the choice, but it's so that there's a discipline. I believe there's a best practice, and we can modify and improve some things. But I think executing against best practices where things are known. In my business, so many things are unknown that there is a best practices way or a variety of ways of conducting a one-on-one that is better than not having one, just choosing your own adventure. So part of that one-on-one, and one of the things that I encourage all of my teammates across FloWater to do with their up team and their one-on-one is ask them, what could I be doing better or doing to add more value or having a bigger impact in the company? And I think if you understand the first question around what are the KPIs and the key fundamental business strategies, e.g., what has to happen by the end of this year or in 2020, what needs to happen by end of 2020, if you're doing that, and then you're aligned with your direct report or your up team and constantly asking them for feedback, you're gonna make more progress. I think, one of the difficult things, I'm trying not to give you too many pieces of answer here, but I have, there's things that are flooding to my mind, but I think one of the things that is really difficult is giving feedback. And I don't think anyone that's worked with me would ever accuse me of difficulty in being direct. I think if anything, they'll probably say I'm overly direct. But it's a balance and it's hard. I mean, frankly, where I feel like I struggle the most is in how I do the directness. I for people that knew me 25 years ago, they would see a very noticeable improvement in my ability to appropriately be direct in ways that are empowering and encouraging. Believe me, it's not always the case even still. I'm sure people that are sitting out there well, wasn't so empowering and encouraging the other day when you were raising Cain about this issue. But one of the ways that I feel like you can get away with that, first is you gotta like people and you gotta really care about your people, because at the end of the day, I want I want them to be successful individually, because that's what's going to make the company successful. So this is like a little bit of maybe the desire to have been a football coach, perhaps at some form in my life, of, extracting that 20% performance index, that last 20%. But one of the best things that you can do is ask your up team and your colleagues for direct feedback. Like, you're sitting in a room and if you want to hear feedback, if you want to hear a real feedback, you need to be prepared to hear, like, it's not even good and bad. I think of it as feedback. It's not like, tell me what you like, tell me what you don't like. It's kind of like, tell me about this thing that we're undergoing. And to me, it's not bad. If someone shits on something and they say, hey, like, I think it's a terrible idea, and here's why, I want to hear that stuff. And the faster as a employee-boss relationship can get to that level of directness, it actually builds trust and confidence. Like, you can enjoy, I have conversations with board members where, they're like, hey, I think you're thinking about this totally wrong, or I think you're missing something. It's like, I'm not defensive about that at all. I'll say that to them as well. It's a real freedom that you have in being able to operate that way. It's really hard to get there. I think it's one of the hardest things in terms of people dynamics to get there. And as an employee, people are like, oh, it's my boss's job to do that. One of the best things that you can do is help facilitate that with them by asking for feedback and saying, hey, can I be direct with you? Will you be direct with me? Like, lay it out there for me.
That's really great advice. I feel like I could probably ask you 12 follow-up questions to.
Well, I feel like I could give you 36 answers to those 12 follow-up questions.
I have a hunch that you could, but I want to make sure I ask you about what you're doing with FloWater, because I love the mission. I love the impact that you're making. So I'd love to just know, how did you even come up with this big, hairy, audacious goal and the idea in the first place?
Yeah, well, let me tell you a little bit of a story around that. And so we just pre-FloWater, I just sold a company. It was a restart. It was a tech company that had failed. I got brought in by the VCs to reboot it. So I'd done a tech startup in New York, kind of from scratch. Then I did a total reboot. Frankly, it was a disaster of a company. And I would never, ever recommend someone go into a tech company at a Series A or a Series B that was totally dilapidated and had no proof of concept, and they were trying to reboot it. You just are better off starting a new company. So I did reboot it. We ended up selling it. It was not a lot of fun, but I learned a ton. I learned a lot from that. And around this time, I had this huge transformation physically. I had 3 big transformations that happened. One is I had kids. So I've got 2 amazing daughters. They're 16 and almost 18 now, Zoe and Royce. And that was one. So they were, 10 and 12 or so at this stage. Second transformation that I had was kind of moving away from the pharma space. And, one of the things that, and this is again, not a dig at pharmaceutical companies or biotech companies, but one of the things that I started to feel really strongly about is moving kind of the progression of humanity and medical care and naturopathic care and alternative care and just self-care towards preventive measures and things that were oriented around wellness. And there's not one brand director or vice president at Eli Lilly that gets paid on prevention, or any pharmaceutical company, J&J or Pfizer, or you pick a company. They get paid on maximizing revenue. It's not, appropriately prescribing it for this condition or that condition. It is based on revenues. And when you're doing that, you're not thinking about the total health of a person. And frankly, at a certain point, I think doctors in many ways conventionally have forgotten that. And so this second transformation that I had, and I'll skip getting back to your question, I'm kind of in the middle of the question, but I'm telling some stories alongside of it, is this narration. If you just heard a gong ring, we just closed the deal, I think. So there's
time to update the scoreboard.
Yeah, exactly. That's exactly what's happening right now.
That's great.
The scoreboard is literally getting updated real time. Second thing was this migration towards wellness and wanting to see like a sense of humanity and health and fitness be different than what it was, like more preventive rather than treatment oriented. And kind of tied to that was my own third revelation, which is, I grew up on Dr. Pepper and donuts. I love Dr. Pepper. Once a year anymore, I'll have it. That's it. Once a year on Thanksgiving, it's a tradition. I stopped that crap a long time ago. But, I played sports in college. So like I was fit. When I was 25, 30, and I was eating donuts every day, like I was in college, and drinking Dr. Pepper all the time and eating like crap, I got to be 290 pounds at one point. I'm 198 right now for comparison.
Wow.
So wow. I think 280 was my high. And so I had this huge transformation around being programmed. And I this is where it all starts for me around, I think sugary carbonated soda is like a legalized form of liquid heroin. I really do. And the reason for that is it's just like big tobacco did in the 60s, which is you market the teens, you market the kids that are at college, you get them hooked on it, has all these addictive properties, you make it cool, you brand it, and then suddenly people have multi-decades, lifelong addictions. And there's a lot of data that shows that nicotine addiction is every bit as strong or second strongest to heroin. It's highly addictive, and it creates lifelong dependencies that people are forever stricken with and has horrible health outcomes. I think of big soda as the same way in many ways. And I got programmed, and then it had these health impacts, and I had this huge revelation where I started running marathons and I started eating super clean and I gave up all that crap. But that's kind of like the gateway drug to a lifelong of bad eating. And so I started seeing my daughters, I'd show up to their soccer games and like people would be bringing Cokes. And I was like, holy shit, like this is how it happens. So that's what got me excited about FloWater is 70% of Americans chronically dehydrated. There's a huge plastic epidemic that is ongoing. No one had done this before, and water hardware had not been reinvented. And so I had a business partner that was actively involved in the business at the time. In fact, he was the founder. I joined him as co-founder. But the real, I think, evolution of the business to a platform play has been in the last couple of years, which, this product you see behind me right here is a refill station. But that's the tip of the spear of building in kind of platform of water infrastructure throughout the world. That was a really long answer to that question, but there's some storytelling that has to go along with that because that's really what, it's rarely, I think, like someone's like, I had this magical idea of like how to make X, Y, and Z and what have you. And sometimes, but it's usually from a problem or a systemic change or like a philosophical like reason for being or something that's like really soul seeking in a sense, coupled with market opportunity.
Quick time check. Do you have another 5-10 minutes?
I do.
Okay, awesome. Are you cool with going
5-10 minutes?
What's that?
Do you have another 5-10 minutes?
Oh, for sure.
All right, great.
I definitely do. And I want to hear more about the story because it sounds like it is a huge transformation, shedding almost 100 pounds and changing a lifestyle. I mean, some people struggle their whole life to make a change like that. What was it for you that made you say, you know what, the way I'm living is not how I want to live?
I'll tell you, it's funny, you're asking these questions that are literally drawing me back to the most distinctive, defining moment that I've recalled before in the past, but it's like driving complete clarity to a moment in time. And by the way, I want to acknowledge, I think like one of my passions is on like this kind of pursuit of improvement and optimizing oneself towards in other words, it's getting the last 20% out of somebody, right? So I don't like getting someone from like 0 to 50%, and that's like a lot of Lilly, by the way, is taking like raw talent and like, but it's not that I don't like it really. It's just that it's too inefficient and it's not as fun as like, how do you extract the last 20% from someone when they don't even know that they got it?
It's taking someone who maybe thinks of themselves as an A player But they're actually at B and getting into A plus.
Exactly, 100%. So, and I think some of that is around how do you activate these things in your life, either remove a roadblock or activate these things that you're on the cusp with. So going back to your question about fitness, I remember two things triggered me. I remember, living in New York City in 2002, year after 9/11, I think they had the marathon the next year. They did. And I remember watching the marathon, and I was married at the time, and I was married for 17 years. It was like one of the casualties, not just of being an entrepreneur and startup, because I wouldn't blame it on that, but that added a lot of stress to it. So I'm no longer married. But I remember telling my wife at the time, I'm going to run the New York City Marathon someday. And I was like starting to get out of shape at that point. And it was kind of like, it kind of became a joke to her, I think, after me saying I was going to run a marathon for like 10 or 12 or 14 years. And then one day I'm like in my mid to late 30s and I'm like, man, I'm getting like really big and I'm not moving in a marathon direction. And I remember seeing all these before and after photos of someone that had taken some protein product. It was that, and then they'd done some workout, and then there was some clean eating program. And I remember just looking at all these before and after pictures, and I'm looking at all the befores and I'm like, that looks like me, that looks like me, that they're fatter than me. And then I'm looking at all the afters and I'm like, this is ridiculous. Like I can do all these other things like moderately well, maybe not out of talent, maybe it's just sheer brute force, but like I can, in hustle and tenacity, I can do all these other things. Like why the heck can't I do this thing called get in shape? And I finally came up to the realization that I just needed to put an action plan in place. And part of the action plan was, I remember like all these things converged at one point. One was realizing I wasn't going to run a marathon if I didn't like make a dramatic change. Two was seeing all these before and after photos. And three was actually realizing that you can't outwork a bad diet. Like you just can't do it. And I never really at the time knew that, because programmatically all the way through high school and college, that's all I was doing all day long. Like didn't matter what I ate. I was like, hey, a little bit more weight for the football field or whatever it was. And then I started like studying this stuff and I realized, man, I'm consuming like 500 calories of soda a day. Like multiply that during the course of the year. So those three things like were a huge like transformation shift. Then it literally came, all right, like set a plan. Like what's the goal? What's your start date? Like go have your binge donuts and like go have your 5 sodas and your 2 bags of Cheetos, and I had a date. And I was like, this is what I'm going to do. I'm going to follow the plan. I'm going to fall off the plan. I'm going to kind of kick my ass a little bit and get back on plan, but also be gracious enough with myself that I didn't guilt me into doing it. And that's kind of what started for me, like a 7-year, I ended up doing a bunch of marathons and doing an Ironman, and I'm not some like fitness maven, but like compared to what I was 20 years ago or 15 years ago, I am. But that also led me to FloWater in some ways as well, around how do you use a company as a platform to activate someone's employee potential. And I don't think of them as employees, I think of them as like teammates and ambassadors and colleagues and people that are like partners, frankly. I think of them as all co-founders, even if they joined. I had someone join today sitting across from me. I think of Joel as a co-founder, but how do you also do that and tie in with aspiration around what you want for humankind or society or a certain demographic?
It occurs to me that this was a personal paradigm shift. And in a lot of ways, what you're trying to do with FloWater is a paradigm shift at a global scale. Can you talk to me a little bit about how that journey has been for you?
I can. So the whole strategy around FloWater. So the vision of the company is to radically change the way people view water, and that it is distributed and consumed. And the mission of the company is to put an end to single-use packaging, not just single-use plastics, but single-use packaging. Let me kind of translate what that means. If you look at the problem in the world today, and let me start with the US. There's a separate worldwide problem that's really prevalent, but we don't have time to address that. But let me just start with the United States. Problem in the US is that, once upon a time we had pretty good drinking water. And then bottled water came out, and Perrier in the 70s and 80s, and there was like Clearly Canadian, it was like flavored sparkling water. And then, Aquafina and Dasani launched like mid 80s, and you had a proliferation of 90s era bottled water and packaged water brands. And now there's like, you go to Whole Foods, there's like 60 different SKUs if you go to a big enough Whole Foods of just packaged water. So we took something that was free and available at the tap, and then what we did is we created this insanity almost to the point of like, well, not almost, literally to the point where one of the top water brands is buying it from Fiji, shipping it to the US, putting it in plastic packaging it, shipping CO2 spewing all over the place, drinking it, throwing this plastic, shipping it back to Asia, ending up in oceans where it turns into particulates, where now the average consumer drinks 2 credit cards worth of plastic every month, just from drinking tap water, if it's been unfiltered, unpurified, or bottled water. By the way, that's a recent study out of SUNY. So,
wow.
Problem number one is like big bottled water looked at this and they're like, hey, we can make a ton of money doing this and get people like hooked on brands and like, taste and flavor profile or mouthfeel or whatever it is. 50% of packaged water is just tap water in a package. Bottled water companies don't sell bottled water. They sell plastic bottles that happen to have water in it. That's what they sell. So, however, there's something that's super interesting that's happened, which is tap water is no longer seen to be desirable from a taste perspective or trusted. Over 70% of Americans don't like or don't trust tap water. And that could be real or perceived. I just gave it it was like 6-8 months ago, but I was in Michigan, in Detroit, doing a TEDx talk talking about water. And part of the underlying thesis is that, today we have to deal with things like glyphosate, Roundup, that are in our tap water that 35, 45, 55 years ago were not in existence. And now we literally are drinking weed killer on tap in microdose amounts. And just like cigarettes, one cigarette's not going to hurt you. 10,000 is not good for you. 100,000 will kill you. And the same goes with microdosing things like contaminants that are being distributed in our water. And so, this is not the municipal water company's fault. I mean, this is glyphosate. This is Roundup issue. This is a microplastic issue. There are over 300 pieces of microparticulate in every liter of water, whether it's bottled or tap now, over 90% of the time. And so what we're building at FloWater is the world's first decentralized, distributed platform that puts a FloWater-like device or piece of technology wherever ultimately there are water egress points, wherever there are water faucets. We want to own the last 6 feet of water infrastructure. So effectively what we're doing is we're treating it twice. We're taking water, using the best of the municipal to chlorinate it, distribute it, deliver it, even though it's through very aging infrastructure. It needs to be cleaned twice at the distributed source so that consumers prefer the bottled water. And that's what we're doing with FloWater. So now that when someone installs a FloWater refill station, we'll see a 2 to 5-fold increase daily in hydration. And this is in all schools, corporations, gyms, doesn't matter the environment. And by the way, they had water there before. It's not like we're taking this out to like, the middle of Arizona saying, hey, will people drink more water? And there wasn't water. We're putting this next to a water fountain, a 5-gallon jug, or water cooler. And also we're seeing a 50% reduction in soda and coffee consumption when simply we have a water refill station, a FloWater refill station present. So what that means is they're drinking more water, we're driving the outcomes. And that's the whole strategy of our company is we're on a mission to radically change the way that people think about water and to decentralize it through this democratized platform, because every consumer deserves access to clean drinking water that they trust.
I love the mission. And you've reached some really impressive scale. It was, I think last I read was 2.38 plastic water bottles a second that you prevent from reaching landfills based on the infrastructure that you've built already?
Yeah, by just to give, yes. And by the middle towards the end of next year, I expect by the end of next year, we're going to have saved 500 million, 500 million single-use packaged water products, including plastic bottles, from entering ocean and being dumped in oceans, lakes, rivers, and landfills. And the goal is $1 billion by the year 2022. So we'll be getting close to the high 100 millions by the end of this year. I mean, we've only got about 3 weeks left, but by end of next year, I expect we'll be well over 500 million saved. And what I'm really excited about in that number is it's a real number. I mean, recycling doesn't work. If anything, look, people should recycle. Don't get me wrong. I recycle, you probably recycle, but the reality is almost all the data shows that 75% of Americans do not recycle. That number has not changed much. So you should recycle, but the better solution is uncycling. Like, how do we create solutions where people don't even need to create the product to distribute something that then has to be done something with in the first place or in the last place? And that's what we're doing with FloWater, is by building this infrastructure. And so, I'm really not only proud of the 60 employees that are sitting in these walls and throughout the United States, and not only super grateful for 50 investors that have believed in me and many others in this company and this vision, but also we have 5,000 customers, almost 5,000 customers across North America, and millions of consumers that are making a migration in a way to something that's not only cooler, but it's also a rebellious way to say no to big bottled water and big plastic and packaged water products, and to say yes to something that you're actually going to drink more of and do more of. So I have a lot of gratitude for the people that were early believers in a mission and a cause, and that are carrying that forward. Now it's a clear mega trend. I mean, away from plastic and packaging. You can
it seems like you've got some real momentum, and I could probably ask you another 2 hours of questions just about how you built that momentum and built that movement. But we're gonna have to save it for another episode. But before we wrap up, I just wanted to ask you one question, which is, for those that are listening in the Powderkeg community or the listening community, how can they help with the mission of FloWater?
It's a great question. Thank you for that. One is I'm a huge fan of starting with incrementalism, right? So just even like on my kind of weight loss or fitness journey, some people like to make dramatic changes, but I think being intentional. So I'll give you an example. Sometimes I'll be in an event and someone will show up and they'll want to refill with their single-use plastic, and they're all embarrassed and ashamed, and they think they think I'm gonna admonish them or shame them or something. And that to me is my biggest high five moment, is they're just stopping, they're making the intentional decision to use one less bottle by refilling the one that they already have. And I think there's a lot that can be learned from that, which is progress. It's just like running a startup company and scaling a company. There's never one thing. It's actually 10,000 things executed on really, really well that end up building this company. And that's through, in my case, lots of super talented teammates and some awesome investors and great customers. But I think my takeaway would be for sure, I'd love you to have a FloWater refill station in your hotel, school, corporation, gym, whatever it is, but that's not the pitch. The pitch is try to just make some mindful, meaningful changes to reducing the impact and evangelizing as to why that's aspirationally a good thing, so that together we can crush plastic and crush the business of big bottled water.
That's a great call to action. I'm going to encourage those that do and listen to this episode to reach out and hit you up on social media to let you know they made the change. And I just want to say thank you, Raz, for sharing your story, or at least some of your story, with us here today. It's been a real pleasure.
Thanks. You're a terrific interviewer and easy to talk to. And thanks again for having me on your show. It's great to reconnect with somebody from Indiana.
It's easy when I'm talking to an entrepreneur that's inspiring and has a lot to share. So I really appreciate it.
All right, great.
Well, that's it for today's show. Thank you so much for listening. A huge thank you to Raz for coming in on the show today. Be sure to check him out as well as FloWater at myflowwater.com. That's MYFLO water.com. And for links to his social profiles and other people, companies, and resources mentioned in this episode, make sure you check out the show notes on powderkeg.com. And to be among the first to hear the stories about entrepreneurs, investors, and other tech leaders outside of Silicon Valley, subscribe to us on iTunes at powderkeg.com/iTunes. We'll catch you next time on Powderkeg Igniting Startups.